This is a continuation of Robert Swindell's Ice Palace, from page 12 to page 21. For a long time he sat on his bed, listening to the small noises his parents made beyond the door of his room, and to the wind outside. The wind made a sad, lonely sound, and as he listened, it seemed to Ivan that something was crying out there in the night. Something small and frightened that touched his window and moved away along the wall. And he lifted a corner of the window curtain and pressed his face to the cold glass and whispered, "Wait, little brother, I will not leave you. I am coming." His breath made a cloud on the glass, and there was only the wind. He let the curtain fall, blew out his candle, and climbed into bed without taking off his clothes. After a while, the door of his room was opened quietly, and Ivan pretended to be sleeping while his mother smoothed his quilt, kissed him, and went out, closing the door behind her. Soon after that, the unhappy couple went to their room, and the house was still. Ivan slipped out of bed and pulled on his boots. Then he took his fur parka and moved quietly to the door. Moments later, he was across the warm, dark kitchen and out into the freezing wind. Next morning, the people were awakened by a terrible cry from the blacksmith's house. The blacksmith's wife had crept early into Ivan's room and found his bed empty. All that day, the people stood about the village in groups, talking, but nobody had heard Starjack come again, and nobody could remember having known anyone as unlucky as the blacksmith and his wife. And far away, through the forest and over the hill walked Ivan. He wore his fur parka, and between his teeth he held a squirrel tail, for if he had not, the wind would have frozen his breath into a mask of ice on his face. Ivan was afraid. He was more afraid than he had ever been, for nobody had ever seen Starjack's land and lived to return home. His head was bowed, and he cried a little as he went along, and his tears became pips of ice before they touched the snow. He was afraid, and sometimes he almost turned around to follow his footprints back to his father's house. But then he would see in his mind a picture of his brother, holding out his arms and crying, in a place that was cold beyond imagining. And then Ivan would brush away his tears and go on. On and on he went, and when it began to grow dark, he found a snowdrift and tunneled into it as his father had taught him. Outside, the screaming wind drove blizzards of snow across the darkness, but Ivan slept safe and warm in his shelter. When morning came, he dug himself out, ate a little food from his pocket, and looked all around. His footprints were gone, and the wind had shifted the snowdrifts into a new pattern so that he could not tell which way he had come. He sighed, turned his face into the wind, and walked on. The snow was deeper now, and Ivan's feet sank far beneath its surface with every step. He began to feel tired and to wonder if he would ever see his home again. He was thinking longingly about his chair by the big, hot stove when there came a sound that felt like an icicle in his heart. It was the long, thin cry a hungry wolf makes when it scents its prey. The cry was answered by another, and soon the pinewood echoed with the howls of the hunting pack. Ivan tried to go faster, but the snow sucked at his boots, making him stumble. He looked back, sobbing. His footprints wound away between the trees, and somewhere back there he knew the wolves were running in his tracks with their noses down to smell him out. A tree. He must find a tree to climb. Wolves can outrun any living thing, but they cannot climb trees. He stumbled on, looking wildly around him, but the trees just here were all pines, with smooth, icy trunks. The wolf cries drew nearer. He looked back. Dim shapes, moved in the dark beneath the trees. He plunged forward, gasping. They had seen him now. A few seconds more and they would be upon him. He glanced all about and ploughed through the snow, the wolves at his heels. He leapt, his hands closed around the lowest branch, and he swung his legs clear of the ground as the first wolf lunged in a flurry of snow.